And we are happy to help with this community as much as we can, because obviously you're an important part of helping our community. And so if we can give back as a brand, if I can give back as an individual, we're happy to be a part of it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these factors and how they can affect your physical and emotional state. So poor sleep, poor nutrition, emotional stress, and physical stress all have a significant impact on chronic fatigue, injury, and health complications. The interesting thing about all of these factors is that they're also cyclical, so they build on each other. Poor sleep can lead to poor nutrition decisions, can complicate emotional stress, which can lead to decision making that complicates physical stress. So today we're going to talk about potentially how making some decisions with regards to nutrition can start to help break this cycle. Obviously, it's not all about nutrition, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but we're gonna start there. Okay, so just an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Macronutrients. So what does everyday good nutrition look like? I'm going to go through carbohydrates, protein, and fat, talk a little bit about what they are, maybe show some scary chemical structures, talk about what good eating strategies look like for each of those. Then I'm going to spend a little time talking about micronutrients, so things to pay attention there, and then switch over to active nutrition, so how to fuel your training, both pre-training nutrition and recovery nutrition. Then a little bit of time talking about supplements for performance and recovery, and then end with hydration. So let's start with carbohydrates. So here are the scary chemical structures, but I put these up here not because I think you need to know them, but because I want to illustrate the concept that carbohydrates are all made of sugar chains. So you get carbohydrates from vegetables. Those carbohydrates look the exact same as the carbohydrates that you get from your Sour Patch Kids. Doesn't mean that those things are on the same level in terms of nutrient density, but carbohydrates have gotten a bad name in this day and age, and I want us to think about them as a simplified molecule, and then we'll get into what potentially makes a good carbohydrate decision and a bad carbohydrate decision, because I'm not one that really thinks that there are good and bad carbohydrates. It's just when you use them. So simple carbohydrates are called monosaccharides because they're a single chain of this sugar. Complex carbohydrates are called polysaccharides, poly meaning many, because they're multiple chains. So as an example, this is glucose, it's a monosaccharide. You put two glucose together, you get a disaccharide, which is sucrose, and you put a chain of them together and you get a starch, which is a polysaccharide. So that's the major division between carbohydrates. Polysaccharides are generally thought to be more nutrient dense foods than simple sugars, and we also store carbohydrates in our body in the form of a polysaccharide, and that's glycogen. So glycogen is stored in the liver and in the muscles. Interestingly, they're used for different things, those storage sites. So liver glycogen maintains blood glucose, and muscle glycogen is what we need to supply energy for muscle contraction. So I want to talk about the use of carbohydrates relative to exercise intensity, because I think this gets into when to use carbohydrates more and maybe when to use them less. So in this graph on the x-axis, I have exercise intensity, or pretty much how hard you're working, and on the y-axis I have contribution to total energy of these two macronutrients, so carbohydrate and fat, which are what you're using to fuel your body. So at low intensity exercise, what are you using predominantly? You're using fat as a fuel. And that's why historically people have always said walking is the best exercise for burning fat. Although a lot of people don't think walking is a sexy way to exercise, it's a great way to exercise. Specifically if you have someone that's trying to drop fat. It's not casual walking, but walking with a purpose for longer periods of time, and your body's going to tap into fat stores as opposed to switching directly over to carbohydrate. As you increase intensity, this changes for a number of reasons, but you get an evening out of the use of these as fuel, and at high intensities your body's going to use carbohydrate. Why is that? Because carbohydrates are processed more quickly and they require less oxygen to switch over into energy. So fat is a great fuel. We obviously all have tons of fat on our bodies stored that we can use as energy, but it requires way more oxygen and it takes way more time to turn into energy. So for high intensity activities, fat is not ideal. For low intensity, it's a great source. That's why a lot of endurance runners, look at keto or look at fat adaptation as a great way to basically fuel their efforts. Higher intensity sports, not so much. Okay, so let's talk about another element of carbohydrate usage, and that's glycemic index, or basically how quickly different forms of carbohydrate affect your blood glucose. So glycemic index is a ranking of these foods relative to a standard. So this is an illustration of that, and on the x-axis I have time in hours, and on the y-axis blood glucose levels. So in the red, these are high glycemic index foods. They increase your blood glucose more quickly than lower glycemic index foods, which affect blood glucose for a longer period of time, but to a much lower extent. So as I said before, I don't really believe in demonizing food groups. So, ice cream has its place in my world, and it always will. But, there are times when, ice cream is more, important, and times when vegetables and lentils make sense. So if you're going to consume high glycemic index foods, it's ideal to have them before, during, and after training. Why? Before training, your body's going to use it as fuel. During training, your body's going to use it as fuel. After training, you need to assimilate that carbohydrate quickly so your body can replenish the glycogen stores it just used. Low glycemic index carbs, because they have that effect much more slowly and over a longer period of time, and because they're more nutrient dense, so your body's getting more out of it than just the carbohydrate, they're going to be used most of the rest of the time of the day that you're consuming carbs. Another thing that I wanted to talk about briefly, because it's thrown around a lot, is glycemic load. So it takes into account the glycemic index of a food, but it also takes into account the amount of carbohydrates in a serving. So it's a classic example. A lot of people, without seeing these numbers, would think, oh, banana's a better choice because, obviously there's not much nutrient, density in watermelon, and, it's full of simple sugars. Well, in actuality, because bananas have more carbohydrates per serving than a serving of watermelon, the glycemic load, or the amount of glucose your blood is seeing in a serving, is much higher with a banana. So this isn't as important to an athlete, but if you're dealing with someone that's pre-diabetic or someone that's trying to lose weight, this distinction is important. Okay, so because we're talking about glycemic index and glucose, blood glucose rising, I just wanted to quickly go over what that actually means. So what is insulin? How does it work? So your pancreas releases insulin basically in response to blood glucose increases. Insulin bonds to your cells. When it bonds to your cells, glucose receptors come to the cell surface and they take in that glucose into the cell. So where can this go bad in the case of prediabetes or in the case of diabetes? Well, a couple of places. Either your cell stops responding to insulin because it's seeing it too much. So if your blood glucose is constantly high, your pancreas is constantly putting out insulin, then this response isn't gonna work anymore. Or potentially, the glucose receptors show up in response to insulin, but they don't work anymore. And so you get this buildup of blood glucose without anything going into your cell, and that's when you get into problems. The corresponding insulin response depends on the digestion time of the carbohydrate, and that's where the real meaning behind glycemic index is. So things that are digested more slowly, that are more nutrient dense, that have more fiber, are going to have a more gradual insulin response, whereas faster digesting high glycemic index carbs have a greater insulin response. So it happens much more quickly, and if you're eating them all the time, it happens all the time. So that's kind of where you start getting chronic issues with carbohydrate processing. So what are actual carbohydrate needs for athletes and active people? Well, strength athletes typically 1.8 to 3.2 grams per pound, and that's 4 to 7 grams per kilo. Aerobic endurance athletes much more, and that's because of the use of carbohydrates as a fuel. And this is, for an athlete that's not trying to use fat predominantly as a fuel. That's obviously going to change if an endurance athlete is on something like the ketogenic diet. But for the majority of people, I think something like that is probably not the best choice unless you're really fueling for something that's in that low intensity, part of the exercise chart that I showed you earlier. So aerobic endurance athletes higher needs 3.6 to 5.5 grams per pound of body weight, which is about 8 to 12 grams per kilo. Athletes who perform shorter duration, higher intensity tasks are less dependent on maintaining muscle glycogen stores, and that's just because they rely on them less for that energy for muscle contraction. So what are recommendations for firefighters? So complex nutrient-dense carbohydrates throughout the day, as we talked about, simple carbohydrates around training and intense work. I would put, depending on whether or not you're training to 100-miler or you're just training for strength, I would put your training more in the strength power endurance phase. So it would kind of be on the fence between these two. And depending on your desires in terms of training stimulus and what you're trying to do with your training, it might be in one camp or the other. So another thing I like to talk about when I talk about carbohydrates is what a serving of carbohydrates looks like. So typically 20 to 30 grams of carbs is one serving at a single sitting. And there's a huge difference between what 20 grams of carbs looks like when you're talking about nutrient-dense foods and when you're talking about processed foods. So beyond there just being a difference in how much room they take up on a plate, there's also a difference in how much other nutrition you get with one versus the other, and the space that it takes up in your stomach. So high glycemic index, you're going to process this quickly and you're going to be hungry right away. Low glycemic index, it's going to take longer to process because it's high in fiber. You're going to be meeting a lot of other micronutrient needs because this is so nutrient dense, and it's going to last you longer. So something to think about when beyond just macro counting, beyond just calorie counting, is just the quality of foods that you're consuming. Okay, so let's move on to protein. Did you guys have any questions about carbohydrates or comments or, yeah?
Generally, you recommend eating carbs at every meal.
I do, yeah. So I think that
pre and post workout.
Exactly, yeah. The type of carbs differs. So those low glycemic index carbs at your meals that aren't directly around training, and then higher glycemic index carbs before and after, because they're going to be processed quickly. So you're either going to use them as fuel or you're replenishing what you just used in terms of muscle glycogen, if we're talking about after. Okay, so protein is a little different from carbohydrates, which we just talked about, and fat, in that it's not predominantly a fuel, right? It's used to repair and rebuild muscle. Now, your body can use protein as a fuel, but it's to a much lesser extent than it will ever use carbohydrate or fat. Exercise increases amino acid oxidation, which is the use of amino acids as fuel, by about 20%, but it's still just like 12% of fuel use during exercise, so still a really small proportion. One of the most important things that protein does is the impact that it has on muscle protein synthesis and on preventing excessive muscle damage. So we do need muscle damage in order to build muscle, but if it's such excessive muscle damage that it's going to affect subsequent workouts, it's too much. So that's where protein comes into play. So a little chemistry, protein's made out of amino acids linked via peptide chains. So we have the primary structure of a protein, on the far side, and those are all different amino acids linked together. When we get into secondary and tertiary structures, those amino acids interact and fold into complex structures, and that's what determines the function of a protein. But for the purpose of this discussion, we're just interested in those amino acids because those are really when people say, I'm consuming protein because for a certain reason, you're really consuming the protein because of the amino acids that protein contains. So there are two major groups of amino acids: essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are amino acids that our body cannot make, as opposed to non-essential, which our body can make. So if our body cannot make them, we rely on protein to get those essential amino acids in our diet. So we want to choose proteins that are high in essential amino acids. And that's really what determines what a good quality protein is how much of each of these they actually have. There is a third class called semi or conditionally essential amino acids. And those are particularly, I think, important for you guys because they are amino acids that our body can make, but under high levels of stress, our bodies may not make enough. And that's when supplementation or consuming protein that's higher in those conditionally essential amino acids becomes important. So examples of that are glutamine, which even in athletes you see lower levels of glutamine following extreme training, and they've done research trying to link that to immune system function. So it can definitely have an impact on health and not just performance.
Are you going to get into the branched chain amino supplements later?
Yeah. So that was a great segue, thank you. So of those essential amino acids, three of the important ones are the branched chain amino acids, so leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And the reason why I say they're really important is because for athletes they have a huge impact on recovery. So studies have shown that leucine stimulates muscle protein synthesis via a pathway called mTOR, and isoleucine and valine to a much less extent have roles that kind of support that that process. Studies have shown that while leucine seems to have the major impact, taking all three together seems to have a greater impact than taking one on its own. So they're also important because, as opposed to most amino acids which are processed by the liver, branched chain amino acids actually go straight to your muscles. So a little different. They can be used as energy, not just for turning on muscle protein synthesis, but they're actually the amino acids that are oxidized to create energy. So they are definitely, of the essential amino acids, the ones I'm going to be talking about the most. So how do we rank protein and protein quality? So basically the main factor is the content of essential amino acids. The secondary factor is how digestible the protein is, so how quickly it can be assimilated. So here's a table of some pretty high quality proteins. This PDCAAS is the protein digestible corrected amino acid score, which takes into account those two things, so how digestible the protein is and the level of essential amino acids. And as you can see, whey is pretty much the gold standard, just because it's assimilated by our body so well and it's so high in EAAs. So for active individuals, it's not just, essential amino acids are important because we need them, but as a secondary, factor, the leucine content, because of the impact that it plays on muscle protein synthesis, is also really important. So this is where I don't really stand on many nutritional soapboxes, but I stand on one when it comes to collagen protein because I'm not a big fan of it for a number of reasons. It is really low in essential amino acids, and it is really low in leucine. And a lot of people take it and say they're having these amazing effects, and there are all these studies showing how important it is. But the studies that have been done with collagen protein have been done relative to a placebo, so relative to no protein, not relative to a high quality protein like whey. So if you take something like collagen protein and you compared it to a whey protein that's high in essential amino acids and high in leucine, my guess, and it's a guess because it hasn't been done, is that it wouldn't perform as well. Yeah.
Do you take collagen protein? They have some of my That's between me and you. So what is it? What is a collagen?
Collagen is an important connective tissue in our bodies, and so I think there's a movement in culture today to source things more primally or paleo, and so a lot of people like it because you can source it from grass-fed animals, and it's not as processed. But when we look at essential amino acid content and look at leucine content in particular, it's not great. And people that say that it helps their hair or their skin or their nails or their joints, that's not how. When you take in protein, it's broken down into amino acids. No matter what protein you take, collagen is not absorbed into your joints to then become your collagen. It's not how it works. So it's not high in any amino acids that would do magic on your collagen. Like, the best thing you can do for your joints is drink lots of water. So if you're an athlete and you're someone that's active, if you have issues with dairy and you can't use whey protein, I would recommend pea protein isolate over collagen protein any day, just because of the amino acid content. So, yeah.
Is this ranking similar to what they refer to as bioavailability of protein, or is that a thing?
So, the bioavailability, as far as I know, I haven't seen that ranking. That's the assimilation. So how bioavailable something is, how quickly you assimilate it. So that takes that into context. This ranking does. Does that make sense? Okay.
What's your bulletproof coffee stance? Do you have a soapbox on that?
No, not really. I mean, I think fats are important in our diet, and if you like the way it tastes, then go for it. Yeah. I'm not like I'm not. I think people, there's nothing bad about collagen protein. I just think there are better proteins if you're an active individual. Yeah. But if you're taking BCAAs as well, then maybe that's leveling things out. Okay, so the last thing
I take both.
Yeah, we know.
The last thing I want to, well, not the last thing, but a lot of people always ask about whether or not vegetable proteins are incomplete. So a complete protein is a protein that has all of the essential amino acids. And it's not that collagen protein doesn't have them, it's just lower in them than other proteins. And the same is true for vegetable protein. So they are complete. Pea protein isolate is actually a great protein, and it's really high in essential amino acids and pretty high in leucine. So while you can get a higher complement of essential amino acids when you combine vegetable proteins, like protein from a legume like pea protein and a protein from a grain like rice protein, you put them together and yeah, you're kind of up there with whey on how many essential amino acids you have. It's not necessary, but it's not a bad thing to do either. Okay.
Is your protein from like a grass-fed organic cow versus just a normal? I mean,
what are the differences?
It's still going to be processed, right?
It's still going to be processed the same. So a couple of things on that. It's a great question. Depends on what protein you're talking about. So are you talking about protein isolate or protein concentrate? So protein isolate is just the protein. It's not going to have a lot of other biofactors or fats. Protein concentrate has more of that, and so then if we're looking at grass-fed versus a grain-raised animal, the fatty acid profile of the grass-fed animal is going to be better, and you're going to get some of that with the whey protein concentrate. With whey protein isolate, not really a factor because it's just the protein. Then there's how you feel about kind of the environmental impact of one versus the other. So, but as far as the protein, same. Okay, so why is it important to meet daily protein needs? Essential amino acids, we talked about that. Prevent muscle protein breakdown and promote muscle protein synthesis. Both are important for recovery. And when carbohydrate stores are low, it can be part of your energy source. So recommendations, 1.2 grams per kilo to 1.6 grams per kilo for most active individuals. So the 1.2 is going to be more endurance focused, which is actually for a lot of endurance athletes, they're consuming less than that because they think that it's like it's kind of my other soapbox is that consuming more protein doesn't make you bulky. So many people think that it does, that you're going to grow muscles just because you increase the protein content of your diet, and that's really not true, which probably most of you know. And so endurance athletes are always like, oh, I don't want to take in more protein because I don't want to put on more mass. But what's interesting is studies that they've done where they look at increased protein content of a diet in an endurance athlete versus a strength athlete. This training stimulus is actually what matters in terms of how that protein is used. So endurance athletes use that protein to create more mitochondria, which are the energy houses in energy houses in your muscles. They're what create energy in terms of aerobic metabolism, and the enzymes related with those pathways. Two things that are really important for endurance athletes. Strength athletes use that protein for recovery and for synthesis, so for putting on mass. So it's actually the training stimulus that dictates how that protein's used, not the total amount of protein that you're taking in your diet. So in this 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo range, somebody doing more endurance training is going to be at the lower end. Someone doing more strength training is at the higher end. There are levels up to 2 grams per kilo, which is almost a gram of protein per pound of body weight. I would consider that a high protein diet. There have been studies showing that potentially consuming that much doesn't do more than provide another energy source. I just read a study showing that anything more than 1.6 grams per kilo, it's not bad for you, but it's not actually used for anything. So keep that in mind. So 20 to 40 grams in a single sitting. There was a study done where they took, I'm going to use 100 grams just for simplification of mass, but there are three groups. One group that consumed that 100 grams in 2 meals, so 50 grams at the beginning of the day, 50 grams at the end of the day. Another group that divided that into 5 meals separated by 3 to 4 hours, so 5 20-gram of protein meals. And then a third group where they had 10 grams, on a much shorter, interval. And what they showed is that total body muscle protein synthesis was highest in the second group. So highest in that group consuming that 20 grams of protein every 3 to 4 hours. And other studies have shown when they've looked at muscle protein synthesis and differing servings of protein, that 20 to 30 grams is the sweet spot. That's what maximizes leucine levels in your body. Your body can't process much more of that in a meal. There has been one study where they kind of changed things a little bit, and as opposed to looking at muscle protein synthesis in like a single limb, like your bicep or your leg, they looked at whole body muscle protein synthesis. And in that study, they showed that 40 grams was kind of that sweet spot number. So that's why I put this range. It depends on body size, depends on, what you want to take in a sitting. But the point that I'm making is that consuming skewed protein, so having high protein breakfast or a high protein dinner, is not ideal for athletes. What you want to do is break that protein up consistently throughout the day. So get 20 to 30 grams, maybe even 40 grams every 3 to 4 hours consistently. One more thing on this. So I'm going to talk about branched chain amino acids later, but this is when branched chain amino acids can come into play, because sometimes you don't want to have a protein shake or a protein-rich meal right before you're going to work out. It's heavy on the stomach, may not sit well, may not be in your stomach for a long time. So that's when something like branched chain amino acids, which are absorbed and in your blood in 20 to 30 minutes and they're light on the stomach, make a lot of sense. So if you can't get in this 20 to 40 grams of protein, at that 3 to 4 hour mark, branched chain amino acids are a great option for that. But that being said, if you are hitting 20 to 40 grams of protein every 3 to 4 hours, adding branched chain amino acids on top of that may not do a ton for you. They are remarkable if you're not hitting your protein needs optimally. But if you are, they might not add a whole much more to your recovery. Yeah?
I was under the impression that they were moving away from lots of small meals every day.
So I think in terms of weight loss and in terms of metabolism, yes, some people do. Some people, if you're trying to become fat adapted, then something like intermittent fasting, it's great for that. But if you are trying to recover because you're pushing your body hard, then denying yourself food for long periods of time, yeah, it's not necessarily about, it's just another stress. So in terms of recovery, this is what I would recommend. All right, so what does 20 to 30 grams of protein look like? I don't count macros. I don't weigh out my food. It works for a lot of people. I don't think it's sustainable. And that being said, if it works for you, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just don't recommend it. So what I like to do is just estimate serving size using my hand, and then also look at how much room a particular macronutrient or food is taking up on my plate. So 20 to 30 grams of protein, which is typically a serving, and what we talked about, getting in every 3 to 4 hours is about the palm of your hand. And there's a range of foods, both animal-based and vegetarian, that can hit this 20 to 30 gram range. So I've listed them here. There are a ton more, but if you guys have any questions about that, we can definitely chat about that more. So let's move on to fat. Any other questions on protein or branched chain amino acids? Okay. So fat is very energy dense. It has 9 kilocalories, which is a calorie per gram, versus 4 kilocalories in carbohydrates and protein. So per gram, you're getting a lot more energy out of fat than you are the other two. It is also readily stored, unlike carbohydrates and protein. So we need to look at it a little differently. It's also used for energy under kind of more specific circumstances than carbohydrates are used. So, I think, most of us were of age when in the 80s fat shaming, period, where, fat made you fat. And sadly, of all the macronutrients, it's kind of got, an uphill battle given the name of it. But fat is really important in our diets. It's critical for physical performance, for recovery, for cardiovascular health, even though for a long time it was blamed for a lot of cardiovascular diseases. We just need to be aware of what kinds of fats we're getting and in what servings. I promised chemistry throughout it, but I just want to talk a little bit about these terms that are thrown around a lot. So monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So this is actually a picture of a fat. These are all fatty acids. So the type of fat is all determined or by the amount of double bonds it has. So in this fatty acid, this is a saturated fatty acid, and the reason why it's called a saturated fatty acid is each of the carbon molecules is as full as it can be with hydrogen molecules. It's saturated with hydrogen. Unsaturated fatty acids have double bonds, and because of those double bonds, don't have as many hydrogens as could be there. So that's why they're called unsaturated. Monounsaturated fatty acids have 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated fatty acids have 2 double bonds. So just an idea of what those terms mean, because people throw them around a lot and don't really understand kind of what the backing is. So saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. They were called a bad fat for a long time, associated with increase in the risk of heart disease. A lot of that research has kind of stepped back a little bit. We need saturated fats in our diet. We just don't need them to extensive amounts. Polyunsaturated fats are really the ones that we want to emphasize and get most of our fat from. Omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids are both examples of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So, I promised that I use my hand to estimate serving size. A thumb is 1 serving of fat. So almonds are great foods. Yeah, they're delicious and they have a lot of nutrients in them. But when you take a whole handful of almonds, that's like a serving for your whole day. So just be aware. If you are doing something like a ketogenic diet, that's different. I'm talking about every day, what most people are doing. So if we want to get into specifics like that, I'm happy to talk about ketogenesis, but it's a different thing. But a serving size for people that are consuming energy in normal amounts from carbohydrates, fat, and protein is about a thumb. 2 servings, which for larger people is typical on a plate, 2 thumbs. So monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are what we want to focus on. Obviously, these fats are not bad, just we want the emphasis here. I'm going to spend a little time talking about omega-3 and omega-6 just because there's such a disproportion of one versus the other in our diets, and that's because omega-6, which you find in things like canola, safflower, and sunflower oils, which are used in processed foods a lot, get consumed in a greater amount than omega-3 fatty acids. And while they're both really important for inflammation responses in our body, we want the ratio of one to the other to be a lot more normal than it is in the typical American diet. And these kind of work when we're high in omega-6 and low in omega-3. Omega-6 kind of pushes omega-3 out of the way, and we get an unhealthy inflammation response. So that's why, you know, everybody's fish oil for the last decade. It's because we get a lot of omega-6s, we're low on omega-3s. But the reverse can be said. If you consume too much fish oil, too much omega-3s, it pushes those omega-6s out, which are also important. So a balance, like most things, is important. But for the majority of people that eat like the typical diet, they probably do need to supplement with omega-3s, or at least focus on getting more fatty fish and things like flax in their diets to increase the omega-3 ratio. Okay, so fat needs, recommendations, 20 to 35% of energy from fat, less than 7% of that should come from saturated fat. I typically recommend that people get their fats from whole foods, so minimal added fat to your diet. If you're eating fatty fish, avocado, nuts, you're getting nutrient-dense foods that are high in unsaturated fatty acids. So nuts, seeds, fish, pasture-raised animals and eggs, olives, avocado, coconut, and cacao, those are all great sources of fat. Okay, let's spend a little bit of time talking about micronutrients. I think a lot of people, when they think of vitamins and minerals, think of supplements. First, you know, if you're getting those low glycemic index carbs, you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, you're getting a lot of micronutrients. So that should be kind of your first line of defense. The more vegetables in your diet, the better. So micronutrients are required in smaller amounts than macronutrients, hence the name switch. They're important because they regulate fluid balance, support the immune system, they provide structural material for your skeleton, they protect the body from damage by free radicals, and they provide the enzymes, coenzymes, and cofactors necessary for metabolism. So a lot of the proteins that are important in our bodies are actually turned on by micronutrients. So if you're deficient in micronutrients, the function of those proteins is not going to be optimal. Okay, I'm only going to talk about a few, and the first of which is going to be iron. So iron is a component of heme iron in the blood. Hemoglobin is important for oxygen transport, and myoglobin is the protein involved in local oxygen transport in your muscles. So both really important for fueling activity. Highly active individuals require more iron and often have diets low in iron. So we lose iron in our sweat. We use more iron because we're active, and these two things added on to a diet that's low in iron can cause a lot of issues. So there are three groups of individuals that are low in iron. Individuals that are either vegetarian or vegan, athletes, particularly endurance athletes, and menstruating females. So if you fall into one of those categories, you should probably be supplementing with iron. If you fall into two of those categories, you really should be supplementing with iron. So most athletes and people that use their bodies regularly, whether it be through work or through training, either paying attention to the iron sources in your diet or supplementing, is important. So there are iron binders in some foods that affect absorption, like legumes, rice, grains, and tea. Does that mean that these foods are bad? No. It just means that if you're consuming them with a serving or a food that is high in iron, or if you're taking them at the same time you're taking the iron supplement, it's going to affect the ability of your body to use that. Foods rich in iron include spinach, lentils, liver, oysters, black beans, beef, tofu, sardines, pistachios, and raisins. The list can be longer, but those are the ones that are highest. If you plan on taking iron supplementation, take it as a standalone. So don't get your iron from a multivitamin for the exact same reason that you wouldn't want to consume iron with these foods. There are certain minerals that affect the absorption of iron. Those minerals are typically in multivitamins. So take it as a standalone. If you're taking iron, typically you might also need to supplement with vitamin B12. And if you're supplementing with B12, you should be supplementing with folate. So my favorite iron supplements have those three: folate, B12, and iron together. And either they have vitamin C added, or you just take it with a glass of orange juice, because the vitamin C increases absorption. So if you're looking for supplementation that's in a capsule form, I would look for something that meets those requirements. Otherwise, just increase these foods in your diet. Okay, vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in our skin via direct sunlight. It doesn't take that much of time to get the amount of vitamin D that we need from simply being outside. The problem is that we're in here most of the time. So if you do spend a lot of time indoors, or particularly in the winter when daylight is shorter, it can be a time that adding a vitamin D supplement to your body or to your diet is a good idea. It's important because it's a modulator of inflammation and immune response. It plays a role in hormone production, so a ton of different hormones in the body, influences neural and mental health, affects cell turnover and regulation. So supplementation recommendations, I think like most people, or like most things, people heard, we're all low in vitamin D, and everyone started taking 5,000 IUs a day. We don't need that much, particularly if we get out on the weekends, in the summer. I think a much more moderate dose is 600 to 1,000 IUs. During the winter, that might increase, and that's when the 3,000 to 5,000 IUs is not a bad idea. You cannot turn vitamin D into its active form without magnesium, and most people, if their diet isn't on point, may be low in magnesium. So if you're eating a lot of vegetables and nuts and beans, which are high in magnesium, you probably don't fall into this category. But if maybe your diet isn't on point, if you're taking vitamin D, you should also take magnesium, about 200 to 400 milligrams, and it's important, the form of magnesium, because Maalox is a form of magnesium, and it is a laxative because it's not absorbed very well. So if magnesium oxide, which I think is what the form of Maalox, is not an ideal way to take your magnesium unless you need a laxative. So the form of magnesium can have a huge impact on how your body uses it. So I would look for a citrate or an amino acid chelate. And when I say amino acid chelate, it's just an amino acid like glycine bonded to the magnesium. So like magnesium glycinate is an amino acid chelate. All right.
I have two questions on that.
Sure.
Is the timing of that that important? Because a lot of magnesium before bed.
Yeah.
With zinc or whatever. Should I take the vitamin D then, or is it within your system? Just
within your system, as long as you're not deficient. And yeah, magnesium, because of the relaxation effect it has on the nervous system, can be great for helping with sleep. So it's great to take before bed.
Right. And then on the sun exposure for getting 3,000 IU, is that without sunblock, like direct, or does that matter?
It does have an impact, and I'm not schooled in what SPF and how that impacts. Oh, okay. But yeah, I mean 5
to 10 minutes, you should be able to obviously do that.
Yeah, and if you have on 20 to 40 SPF, you're still getting sun through that. So
course,
yeah.
Okay.
I've got a quick question.
Sure.
On absorption. This is going back under the iron.
Yeah.
You talked about the iron binders, legumes, rice, grain, and meat.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're, as athletes, we're deficient in iron, when should we take those supplements? Because if we're taking them as whole foods, should we take these whole foods and avoid the grains, rice?
Yeah, so
what does it take to absorb, I guess?
I think if it's more of an issue if you're taking a concentrated iron dose in one sitting, then do you want to take it with something that could bind to that? No. But if you're consuming foods that are high in iron over the course of the day, it's not as much of an issue. I meant more of if you're taking that supplement.
So if you are taking the supplement, how long should you take
I don't have a time frame recommendation for you per se. I mean, I would take, if I were taking, which I do take iron, I take it in the morning with a glass of orange juice, and I usually don't see grains and beans in my diet unless I'm having huevos rancheros, until later in the day. So, yeah. Yeah, right? Yeah.
Can we increase our iron intake by using iron skillets? Like cooking the food in iron skillets?
I'm a big fan of cast iron skillets, but I'm not sure how it impacts the iron intake. Yeah.
People say that you do, so that's good.
Yeah, it is. I have no idea.
Really?
Yeah.
What are some good tests or diagnostic tools you can use to determine whether or not you're getting your micros? I mean, how do you figure out where you're deficient in to adjust your diet or supplement?
You can get a blood panel done at any, I would, if you have a family care physician or a doctor you see regularly, ask them. But yeah, I've had a blood panel done at my primary care provider.
Cool.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So antioxidants, this is another one that if you're consuming a lot of the vegetables and fruits in your diet, it's not going to be as much of an issue. But also with what you're putting your bodies in terms of training every day, your needs might be higher. But they're important because they defend cells from free radicals. And free radicals are molecules that have one or more unpaired electrons that then can attack tissue and cause issues with inflammation. So they're naturally occurring in the body, free radicals are, and they increase during exercise. So once again, if you're training a lot, this becomes an issue. You can eat foods naturally high in antioxidants to help with this. Beans, berries, apples, pecans, plums, dark chocolate. These are all examples. And you can also supplement. But the issue with supplements of antioxidants is that when you consume tons of antioxidants in the form of a supplement, it's less issue with whole foods. Antioxidants can actually become what are called pro-oxidants, which are free radicals. So like with anything, be more moderate with your use. I don't actually recommend consuming supplements that are purely antioxidant supplements, because I think that's easily a need met through just increasing your intake of fruits and vegetables. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about active nutrition. I'm going to start off with some pre-workout nutrition guidelines. So nutrient timing is an important consideration for optimal performance and recovery. That's because when you consume food, when you consume protein like we just talked about, or carbohydrates, really determines what your body has on board to perform and what your body has on board to effectively recover. So for pre-workout nutrition, we don't want to start in a hole. Your pre-exercise meal or snack for longer training efforts, and when I say this, it should be about over 90 minutes. And the reason why I make this distinction is that I think a lot of people often overdo nutrition on shorter workouts. When really your body has enough on board to fuel that workout, or you've eaten 2 hours beforehand and that's good. So it's really when we're dealing with longer things that you need to make a more concentrated effort to focus on pre-workout nutrition. So fluids and electrolytes for hydration should be one of the most important things that you focus on. 12 to 24 ounces. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, about what that actually means. If you have the time and you're doing something long, 3 to 4 hours before, you should look at having 150 to 200 grams of complex carbs, some protein and some fat. So this is once again for an individual that's consuming kind of the everyday diet that has normal amounts of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. The reason why I have a number here for carbs and less so for protein and fat is because we're talking about fueling this upcoming exercise, and protein and fat are going to be less likely to be used as fuel. If you don't have this much time beforehand, so your morning workout, 2 hours before, you can have a smaller meal with carbohydrates that are easier to digest. So that would be more a mixture of simple or complex carbs. So these two are or, so either or, if you have not both. If you have time, have a larger meal that has more nutrient dense foods, but with more time to digest. If you don't have the time, have a more easily digestible meal in a shorter time frame. Either way, consuming about 25 to 30 grams of simple carbs and potentially branched chain amino acids, depending on how much protein you've had recently, 30 to 60 minutes beforehand can help. Why? Because this is elevating your blood glucose, and the branched chain amino acids are going to prevent that excessive muscle protein breakdown. So any questions about pre-workout or training guidelines? Okay.
That was 90, just for 90 minutes and
over 90 minutes, and the reason why I throw that out is because then it becomes a lot more significant that you get that 3 to 4 hour meal beforehand. But if you're doing something closer to like the 90 to 2 hour range, smaller meals beforehand are make more sense. Yeah.
So about training in a fasted state, what would be beneficial in terms of intensity, duration in a fasted state? I mean,
Sure.
It seems like if you're doing any sort of HIIT training and stuff like that, you're going to want sugars.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're training in a fasted state, most people are doing that because they want to become more fat adapted. So they want their body to use fat as fuel over carbohydrates. So when does your body use fat as fuel? It uses fat as fuel during lower intensity exercise. If you're asking your body to do something that's of high intensity, unless you're ketogenic and using ketones as energy, which is a completely different thing from being fat adapted, then your body is still going to need those carbohydrates. So you're not going to perform if they're not there. So if you're trying to become fat adapted, yeah, doing fasted workouts is great, but make sure they're on the lower intensity level. You can build up cardiovascular efficiency and therefore performance at around a certain intensity by doing, so for endurance athletics, it's called long slow distance, or LSD. Sounds really funny, but you basically run for long periods of time at a really low intensity, and you get so efficient cardiovascularly at that intensity that you're able to slowly build up speed, and so you become faster at a lower effort level, and you're still able to use fat as fuel. And that's why it makes sense, for endurance athletes to kind of tap into that. But if you're doing something that's high intensity, you're going to use carbohydrates. If the carbohydrates are not there, then you're going to crash. Yeah.
It's great that she touched on that 90-minute thing, because what's really unfortunate in kind of our atmosphere is you see people that train for like 45 minutes or even an hour, and they want to like lean out or something, but they do like a pre-workout supplement or even meal or something for energy, and then they do a post, and they didn't burn that many calories in the 45 minutes or an hour, but
Yeah.
they consumed more than that, so they're like, it'd probably be better just to not work out, you know what I mean? So it's really great that she touched on that 90-minute, and like how much energy our body does have on board. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So for like firefighters, is the intermittent fasting recommended at all, or is it kind of?
So I wouldn't recommend it based on what I know of your training. So you can become fat adapted through just including more fats, good quality fats in your diet, and by training at lower intensities. But fat adaptation adds a certain amount of stress. And so if you're in this 48-96 cycle where you're having to recover and train and catch up on sleep, adding an extra stress of being food deprived is not ideal. I think you can do intermittent fasting to a less extent than is often talked about, so smaller windows, and still get some benefit without it being stressful. So I would say if you are interested in doing it and there are a lot of beneficial effects, maybe try a smaller window.
Okay. So smaller fasting.
Yeah.
I think a good point to make on that too is not only the way we're training, but it's the unknown of at any given time we can have a high intensity workout. So if you're going to have an unknown high intensity workout any minute, then it may not be the best. Is that what you're saying?
That's a great point. Yeah.
I just want to add on top of that, if someone chooses, because I think part of our role is going to be
helping people do what they want to do, right? Because some guys are just going to do intermittent fasting because they believe in it and they want to do it.
Well,
so how do we do it right if they're going to do it? I think encouraging emergency snacks, having that in their engine or wherever they're at. If they're fasting and then they have total fiber, just like you said, they're going to be glycogen depleted. They're not going to be functioning mentally like they should be. So they should have something to get in real quick before to keep them safe, right? That is my
option could be a good option as well.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later.
Some of our response districts have fantastic built into it.
It just happens.
That's why you have snacks in the
RFP, rescue food bag. But it's got to have not legumes. It's got spinach.
Okay, so post-exercise recovery, we've talked a little bit about this already. Carbohydrates, you want them to be more the kind of the high glycemic index variety because they're stimulating glucose and insulin receptors, driving amino acids into the cell, replenishing glycogen. Protein, you want it to be high quality protein rich in essential amino acids, particularly leucine, because you're turning on muscle protein synthesis. So things like meat, fish, eggs, dairy, whey or casein protein powders are high-quality vegetable proteins like pea protein or rice protein. So what does that actually look like? So there's, it's been called like this golden period after you exercise within 60 minutes. My recommendation is, if you don't get it in 60 minutes, you're still going to benefit from it if it's within a 2-hour window. So don't stress so much about, getting it in within that first hour. Just get it in as soon as you can. What should it look like? So research has shown that kind of the 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio of carbohydrates to protein is key. So if we put actual numbers behind that, you're looking at 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrates and about 15 to 20 grams of protein. So that protein level can go up even more. Obviously, we talked about 20 to 30 grams being kind of that ideal serving size to really get leucine levels where they need to be for muscle protein synthesis. So if you were, doing 30 grams, you would be more kind of along the lines of 90 grams of carbohydrate. So it's just that ratio that's important to really replenish glycogen and to get muscle protein synthesis going. You want to also have about 16 to 18 ounces of fluid and electrolytes for rehydration. The greater the intensity and duration, the greater the need for this is. So once again, exactly what Paul said, if you're exercising for 45 minutes, taking in 60 grams of protein or 60 grams of carbohydrate and 20 grams of protein, it's going to negate what you just did. So really think about whether or not you just spent the glycogen in your muscles and whether or not you need to really bring in that carbohydrate. I would argue that taking in some protein, no matter what, is going to help you recover well and help you turn around and do another high-intensity workout either later that day or the next day. The carbohydrates that maybe are less necessary after shorter workouts. Okay.
Is that goal dependent though? I mean, what if you have somebody who's training for hypertrophy or something like that? Does that still not matter? Or
yeah, so if you're training to put on mass, then the key to mass gain is just taking in a crap load of food.
Right.
So yes, yeah, and obviously there's specific training regimens that are going to help with that. But yeah, then go ahead, all the carbs and all the protein. Yeah.
Hey, that's actually a question in regard to strength then, because it's not really you're not focusing on glycogen system. Right, so it may not be as important to, if you're just doing some strength training with not getting into the high intensity stuff too much, you're just focusing on trying to get stronger. Would it be more important to look at these macro, or even the micronutrients, just to make sure that we have what the body needs to make those neuromuscular connections for that I guess, adaptation?
Yeah, so if you're eating a pretty good whole foods diet, then you're going to have the micronutrients you need. I don't necessarily think they need to be consumed directly after exercise, so in that post-recovery meal. But you're right in that if you're doing a strength workout where you use some glycogen stores, but to a much less extent than you would during something that's cardio-based, then yeah, once again, the carbohydrates aren't going to be as critical. But protein, important. Yeah. Okay, so kind of just a summary, as I said earlier, like I like to look at the ratio of the different food groups on my plate to really kind of help me determine, what a plate of food should look like. So anytime meal, always veggies should definitely take up the most space on your plate. I would also say as a disclaimer, vegetables are cooked differently in the South than they are in other places of the world. Are they delicious? Yes. But does that affect, the macro content of those veggies? It does. So also pay attention to how they're cooked and what you're adding. It gets back to the whole added fats versus getting fats from your diet. If you're adding a ton of butter and oil, it doesn't matter if it's olive oil, but if you're adding a ton of it when you cook your vegetables, it changes what those vegetables mean on this plate. So pay attention to how you cook them as well. But vegetables should be primarily take up the most space, protein to a lesser extent, and fat to an even lesser extent. The beverages you choose obviously add to your caloric intake. I'm definitely not afraid of having a beer with my dinner, but I'm also aware that it's a significant source of carbohydrates. So pay attention to that. Post-workout meal looks a little different because of the importance of protein to help with recovery. It also, we have starches added in. Why? Because starches are easily digestible and absorbable carbohydrates, so they're really important. So just an idea proportion-wise of how your meals could change in how they look in terms of any time or in terms of something you're consuming post-workout.
Is that the next meal following your workout?
Yeah.
In place of a post-workout shake?
That would be in place of a post-workout shake if you were getting it from Whole Foods.
You go back to your intake.
Yep. Any other questions? That was a good one. Okay. So supplements for performance and recovery. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Evan and I are going to talk about more in the next segment, but these are really the supplements more research has been done around and have a kind of more proven effect on performance and recovery than others out there. So beta-alanine. So beta-alanine is really taken to build up something else in your muscles called carnosine. So carnosine is an intramuscular buffer. What is a buffer? A buffer basically quenches rises in acidity, so or a decrease in pH. So acidity is what causes that muscular burn that we're all really familiar with. For a long time, people attributed that to lactic acid, which is not true. It is attributable to acid or the increase in hydrogen ions in your muscle, but lactate exists as a completely different thing, and your body can actually use lactate as fuel. So although you still hear people always saying the lactic acid, and lactic acid is often measured because actually when you take lactic acid out of the body, that's when hydrogen and lactate combine to form lactic acid, and that's why for such a long time people thought it was lactic acid. But lactate is important, and hydrogen ions are really the culprit. So we take carnosine because it basically prevents that increase in acidity, and by doing that, it increases in endurance. So one of the things that has an impact on our ability to perform is that increase in acidity. So a side effect of taking beta-alanine is what's called paresthesia. If you guys have ever taken pre-workouts and you get that tingling in your hands or your feet or your scalp, that is the beta-alanine. It's not a bad thing, but it can become extremely uncomfortable if you're taking large amounts of beta-alanine. So effective doses of beta-alanine are in the 2 to 6 grams gram range, but it's something you have to take every day. Similar to creatine, it's not something that you take and it has this acute impact on what you're about to do. It actually builds up in your muscles, and it's the increase in your body that then has the beneficial impact on your workout. So 6 grams will make you want to tear your skin off. 2 grams is a much more tolerable dose. So it'll take longer for a 2-gram dose daily to have that impact on performance, but taken day in and day out consistently, it will. This is just like a diagram I pulled off of bodybuilding, just makes it really easy to kind of understand. So exercise releases hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions decrease pH, which is an increase in acidity, and you get performance decreases because of that. Carnosine buffers those hydrogen ions. So pH levels then are stabilized, and you look like this guy. Yeah, totally, right? So beta-alanine supplementation has been shown to increase carnosine levels by like 40 to 60% after a month. So there's a lot of research showing it can be beneficial, and that benefit is through endurance. Citrulline malate is another one. So there have been a bunch of supplements that also just include L-citrulline, which is an amino acid and has a great impact. The reason why I'm talking about citrulline malate is these two both have positive impacts differentially on exercise. So taken together, you're kind of getting 2 in 1. So citrulline is actually converted to arginine, and arginine increases nitric oxide production and vasodilation. So vasodilation is the diameter of your blood vessels, and increased diameter increases blood flow, increases oxygen and nutrient delivery, and removes waste like ammonia from your muscles. So it can have a number of beneficial impacts. Malate is important for energy production. It plays a role in the Krebs cycle, which is one of the cycles in our body that produces the most ATP. And it reduces acidity, so it's also a buffer, and by doing that improves endurance. There's also been studies showing that it helps with phosphocreatine resynthesis, which we're going to talk about creatine and phosphocreatine in the next slide, and that's important for ATP production. So how and when? 5 to 6 grams is an effective dose, and before or during training. So this is something you would take in a pre-workout and maybe continue sipping that pre-workout into your training. Okay, so creatine. Creatine is probably one of the best studied supplements. It's naturally occurring in meat and fish. Why? Because we store it in our muscle, so if you're consuming that, you're consuming another animal's muscle. Omnivorous diets contain about 1 gram per day, and creatine, when you consume it, is stored in your muscles as phosphocreatine. So chemistry, this is creatine. This is creatine with a phosphate, phosphocreatine. By either adding this phosphate or removing it, you're donating the phosphate to what's called ADP and creating ATP, which is basically the energy currency in your body. You can also get ATP broken down to ADP and donating this phosphate for phosphocreatine. But creatine by itself doesn't do anything for you. It just holds on to phosphates that it then gives away to make ATP. So I like to go over this because if you supplemented with creatine and you didn't exercise, nothing. So it's really you that makes the, how hard you're willing to work and how much effort you're willing to put in it. Having more creatine and more phosphate on, in your muscles is going to be helpful, but if you don't provide that training stimulus, it's not going to do anything. So what it does is that it increases our reliance on what's called the phosphocreatine portion of like energy production. So I think you guys just talked about energy systems, so you should know a little bit about the phosphagen system or the phosphocreatine system. It's the first energy system that our muscles basically rely on. It's a really short window, so it's like 2 to 10 seconds. And that's with normal creatine stores or phosphocreatine stores in our muscles. If you're supplementing with phosphocreatine, you can increase this 2 to 10 seconds to an upper end of 12 to 15 seconds. So it's not a huge amount of time, but if you're doing powerful dynamic things like lifting weights or bouldering, anything that requires, short, quick, powerful movements, it can have a huge impact. They've shown, increases in 1 rep max after, a loading phase of creatine of like 20%, which is a lot. So how and when? 3 to 5 grams every day is kind of what's called a maintenance phase. If you choose to load with creatine, all it does is it increases the speed at which your muscles are able to build up their stores. So that typically looks like 20 grams. I think it's like 0.3 grams per kilo if you're going to do it per body weight for 7 to 10 days, and then you drop to a maintenance phase. So it's just getting to a point where you're going to see efficacious results more quickly. Creatine does cause about a 1 to 2% body weight gain due to water retention. If that's an issue, you can always come off of creatine. You don't lose the strength you gained from training. You just lose the water weight. So it will then actually increase your power to weight ratio because you'll be lower in weight and you'll be stronger. So something to consider if that's a concern. So research has shown increases in total work, specific 1 rep max, and lean body mass through creatine supplementation. Yeah?
Should you take creatine with sugar?
Yeah, so taking it with sugar and the insulin response, increases the absorption. Yeah. Okay, branched chain amino acids. So we spent a little bit of time talking about this already. Leucine, isoleucine, and valine. They're essential amino acids found in high-quality proteins. They can be used for energy. They prevent excessive muscle protein breakdown and turn on muscle protein synthesis. So a lot of people historically have used them after training. I actually recommend them before and during training because then you get the amino acid levels high in your blood as that muscle damage is actually occurring. And then, of course, following up with protein that's high in essential amino acids because then you're getting that second dose of amino acids that's going to help with recovery and muscle protein synthesis. So how much? At least 1.75 grams of leucine. This is kind of the amount that you see in 20 grams of protein, of high quality protein naturally. And that's typically 5 grams in a 2 to 1 ratio is what you see in most supplements, and that's fine. That's going to be, do my math real quick, 2.5 grams of leucine and 1.5 grams of each of the other two for a total dose. So now let's talk a little bit about hydration. This is, I think, particularly important with this group. So water is the largest single constituent of the human body. It's about 60%. Water losses occur due to respiration, urination, occur in feces, and through skin. General recommendations for daily water intake are about 3.7 liters for males and 2.7 liters for females. So this is from both food and beverage and the metabolism of nutrients through digestion. I recommend that a lot of people do a sweat test around exercise or training, and this is just to get an idea of how much you as an individual in a given environment loses sweat. And it can change drastically from person to person, and it can change drastically when you put that person in different environments. So depending on humidity, depending on heat, depending on what clothes you're wearing. It's really easy to do, and so do it a lot and see how it changes. Basically, you weigh yourself before training, naked with an empty bladder. You complete your workout or training, so typically your results are going to be per hour. So you can do it for an hour, you can do it for multiple hours. You're just going to have to divide it by the number of hours you do it for. Note how many ounces of fluid you're drinking. Weigh yourself after your workout or training, and you're going to subtract this post-training weight from the pre-training weight, noting that about a pound of body weight is about 16 ounces of fluid. So you're going to add the ounces lost in your sweat, so this number, to the ounces you consume to get the approximate ounces that you should be drinking. So let's go through an example. If your pre-workout weight was 150 pounds and you consumed 8 ounces while you were training, and your post-workout weight was 149 pounds, 150 minus 149 is 1 pound. So you lost 16 ounces as sweat. You then, you had that 8 ounces while you're training, so you add that to the 16 ounces, and you get 24 ounces. And that's about what you should consume while you're exercising if you're this individual. There's a lot of concern about hyponatremia and consuming just that as water. So studies have shown that if you're aiming for about 80 to 90% of this while training, that's ideal. And that's because your body does a pretty good job of dealing, to a certain extent, heat and excessive heat and lots of clothes when you're in a fire is a whole different scenario. But if you're out exercising, your body does a pretty good job of regulating water loss by regulating concentration of electrolytes. So you don't want to add 100% of that fluid loss as just water, because you're going to be diluting the electrolytes in your body. So 80 to 90% of that is a good idea, and electrolytes in that fluid is also a good idea. So when you sweat, you lose mainly sodium. Average loss of sodium, once again, this is truly dependent on an individual. So average loss is about 500 milligrams of sodium per pound of sweat, but that range can be anywhere from like 200 to 1100 milligrams. So they now have places where you can get the sodium content of your sweat tested, and could be a good idea to do. But you can also just start, with an average replacement of about 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour, and then play with it. Yeah.
There's disorders as well that very that they're a lot, right? Like hypothyroidism will, I guess, create a situation where all of your sodium is almost taken out. Like, there's an issue there that can be created if you have that condition. So, is there any other ones? Am I correct?
I don't know necessarily about conditions, but if you eat a lot of salt in your diet, you're going to lose more salt in your sweat. So it can be impacted just by habits, dietary habits. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not as well versed in hypothyroidism and so I actually didn't even know that.
I based that off of the fact that that's something that's what
right.
Looking at hypothyroidism.
Okay.
Can that cycle deteriorate as well, as far as like you eat more salt, you lose more salt? And is there any studies that you know of, Shannon, that show like taste or cravings of high sodium if you are losing sodium, like in your salt?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say a study but I've read enough in nutrition textbooks about that craving for salt when you are losing a lot of salt. But I've also read that, the less salt in your diet, the more your body regulates how it's used. So your body's pretty good at figuring that out, and that's why just replacing that water or that fluid loss with water, that's where things become dangerous, because you're taking your body's ability to regulate and you're diluting internal concentrations. And that's when you get into danger.
I've had tested before, and because of how much water I drink, like consistently for years, I've eat like 2 complete. So they thought I was like something. And I was like, no, I just drank
a lot of water.
Water that my body doesn't like a lot. But I've noticed through my own personal experience, like I definitely crave a high sodium diet, and I think a lot of it is because of
water intake.
I think that's just like because it can't.
Yeah, I mean, I've had salt cravings during endurance races, and had a huge impact on like subsequent performance because of salt taken in at a particular aid station. Like, it's pretty amazing the impact it can have when there's an irregularity. Yeah. Okay, that's all I got for you. So happy to take any other questions. Yeah.
What about nutrition in long duration
workouts like skiing, mountain biking for 3, 4, 5 hours. What should you look for, I mean, energy gels and that kind of stuff, or?
So I'm not going to say energy gels are bad. They are a simple carbohydrate. Your body will use them. I think different things work for different people. You've got to try them out. The issue with energy gels and anything that you're taking in, when you're taking in a concentrated sugar, is that much like anything we were just talking about with salt, your body tries to equilibrate between the sugar in your gut and the sugar in your system. And so if what you're taking in is much more concentrated than what's in your system, it sends water from your blood into your digestive tract. So which does a couple of things. One, it dehydrates you, and two, it causes GI distress. So if you are going to use gels, which they can be a great fuel, make sure you're taking them with tons of fluid. Because essentially when you take them with a huge swig of water, you're pre-diluting that sugar. I tend to go for things that, so I used to do a lot of endurance mountain biking, and I'm a big believer in, like, for me, having things like potatoes and rice cakes that I would make out of white rice and whole foods like that worked better. I'd had a lot of digestive issues with using only gels. I still use gels sometimes, just not exclusively. A lot of people have really found that products like Tailwind, which is a electrolyte and fuel product. It contains, I think it's like a 4 to 5% glucose solution, and it has about 300 milligrams of sodium per serving. So it's not a ton of sugar that would cause that GI distress, but enough that if you are only consuming that, it kind of can fuel you for that duration. So the guy that developed it has done the Leadville 100 like 10 times under 9 hours, and a lot of people, both runners and bikers, have had success with that. Yeah, so the key with longer endurance things is kind of just like a steady intake of fuel. So every 20 to 30 minutes you should be taking something.
What about, would the BCAA be more effective than like those gels and stuff then?
So BCAA,
or is that just a different?
It's different. So BCAAs I definitely recommend. We have a lot of endurance athletes on our team that use the BCAAs while they're exercising, but that is to help with recovery. So you're taking it so you recover better, and I would never sacrifice taking in electrolytes. So if you're in a hot environment for taking in BCAAs, like electrolytes should be your priority, but if you can get in some, like switch a water bottle out, it's a good thing.